The glow of phone screens lights up millions of faces, and everyone is watching the same thing: war. Every few minutes, a new headline appears. One channel says an attack has happened. Another claims a response has already been launched. Some talk about missiles. Others talk about fighter jets. Others focus on air defense systems. But behind all these images, behind every explosion, and behind every dramatic headline, there is one enormous question. Is it possible for a country to suffer serious damage, not because it lacks missiles, drones, military equipment, or decades of experience, but because of a single miscalculation? If we flip through the pages of history, the answer is far more frightening than most people realize. Napoleon made that mistake. Hitler made that mistake. The Soviet Union made that mistake in Afghanistan.
A region where a single mistake can drag multiple countries into crisis. A region where a limited strike can suddenly grow into a much larger conflict. In such an environment, the most valuable asset a country possesses is not its missiles, tanks, or fighter jets. It is the ability to predict how the other side will react. This is where the story becomes complicated, because many analysts argue that the most important issue in the recent conflict was not simply the military power of Iran or the military power of Israel. The real issue was that both sides were trying to predict exactly what the other side would do next. And this is where history repeatedly proves that human beings make mistakes. Very often, we analyze our opponents through the lens of our own assumptions. We assume they think the same way.
That is usually the moment when a crisis truly begins. During the early days of the conflict, media outlets were flooded with analysis. Some talked about deterrence. Others discussed surprise attacks. Some focused on preparedness. Others focused on mistakes. Yet one aspect received far less attention than it deserved: psychological warfare. A battlefield with no explosions, no smoke, no missiles, yet sometimes more destructive than all of them combined. When millions of people are exposed to conflicting information every hour, when rumors spread at the speed of light, when truth and misinformation become difficult to separate, a new battlefield emerges. And in that environment, making the right decisions becomes harder for everyone. Not just ordinary citizens, but political leaders, military planners, and national security officials. This is one of the defining features of modern warfare. In the past, it could take days or even weeks for news from the battle.
Some argue that the greatest mistake any nation can make is assuming that its adversary will never cross a certain line. Because history has repeatedly shown that nations sometimes do exactly that. Not necessarily because they have become stronger, but because circumstances have changed. Priorities have changed. Political realities have changed. And what seemed impossible yesterday suddenly becomes possible today. That may be why military academies around the world teach a lesson that has survived for generations. A commander's greatest enemy is often not the opponent standing across the battlefield. It is overconfidence. The more certain people become, the easier it is to overlook risks. The easier it becomes to dismiss warning signs. The easier it becomes to be surprised. And in war, surprise remains one of the deadliest forces imaginable. In the end, the question of what the biggest mistake in the recent conflict may have been does not have a simple answer. Perhaps it was not one decision, not one missile, not one operation. Perhaps it was a chain of assumptions.
But here's where the story gets even more interesting. Because if you ask most people what wins wars, they'll probably say military power. More missiles, more aircraft, more advanced technology, more soldiers. And at first glance, that sounds logical. But history keeps proving something completely different. Sometimes wars are lost long before the first missile is launched. Not on the battlefield, but inside meeting rooms, inside intelligence reports, inside assumptions that everyone believes are correct. Think about it for a second. Imagine you're playing poker. You've spent months studying your opponent. You know his habits. You know his style. You think you know exactly what he'll do next. Then suddenly, he makes a move you never expected. Not because he's stronger than you, not because he has better cards, but because your entire strategy was built around the belief that he would never make that move. And just like that, everything changes.
That's exactly why so many military historians say the most dangerous words in any conflict are, "They would never do that." Because throughout history, countries have repeatedly been shocked by actions they believed were impossible. And when that happens, panic often follows. Not among ordinary people first, but among decision makers. Because now every plan has to be rewritten, every calculation has to be updated, every assumption suddenly becomes questionable. And that creates uncertainty, a lot of uncertainty. Now, imagine being responsible for the security of an entire country. Every hour, new intelligence arrives. Some reports are accurate. Some are wrong. Some are deliberately misleading. Some are already outdated by the time they reach your desk. Meanwhile, social media is exploding. News channels are running 24 hours a day. Experts are arguing. Rumors are spreading. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise, you have to make decisions that could affect millions of lives.
They don't see leaders trying to figure out what information is real and what isn't. They don't see analysts working through the night trying to predict what happens next. And they definitely don't see the fear of making the wrong choice. Because in war, the cost of being wrong can be enormous. Sometimes a country reacts too slowly. Sometimes it reacts too quickly. Sometimes it expects one type of attack and receives another. And sometimes it becomes so focused on one threat that it misses a completely different danger. That's why many experts argue that modern conflicts are becoming less about raw firepower and more about information. Who knows more? Who understands more? Everyone thinks they know what's happening, but very few people actually do. And that's where another important lesson appears, one that almost every major conflict in history has taught us. The side that learns the fastest often gains the biggest advantage. Not necessarily the strongest side, not necessarily the richest side, not necessarily the side with the most weapons. The side that adapts, the side that recognizes its mistakes, the side that changes course before it's too late. Because every war creates surprises, every single one,
No matter how much preparation goes into it, no matter how advanced the technology becomes, no matter how experienced the commanders are, something unexpected always happens. The question is never whether surprises will occur. The real question is who responds better when they do. And maybe that's why the debate surrounding the recent conflict remains so intense. Because people aren't only discussing missiles or military operations, they're discussing decisions, judgments, assumptions, predictions. They're trying to understand.
But now, let's get to the most important part of this story. The point where we have to ask ourselves a simple but very important question. If a mistake really happened during a war, is finding that mistake only about blaming someone? Or is it about understanding what could be improved in the future? Because history has a strange habit. People usually remember wars through victories and defeats, but the countries and nations that truly learn from history are not defined only by the battles they win or lose. They are defined by their ability to recognize their mistakes and grow from them. Maybe that is the biggest difference between a country that succeeds and one that fails. Whether it only searches for someone to blame after a crisis, or whether it has the courage to look honestly at its own weaknesses. Now, if we return to the speed of decision-making, to the management of public perception. Because in today's world, wars are no longer fought only between armies. Modern wars happen across multiple battlefields at the same time. One battlefield is in the sky. One is on the ground. One exists in cyberspace. And perhaps the most important battlefield of all is inside people's minds. Imagine a country that performs well on the military battlefield, but loses the information war.
Now you might ask, does that mean everything comes down only to Iran's mistakes? No. The reality of wars is never that simple. Every conflict is shaped by many different factors. The decisions of one side, the decisions of the other side, regional conditions, international pressure, technology, economics, and even unexpected events. War is not a simple game where you can say one side played well and the other side played badly. Sometimes a correct decision at the wrong time can create a negative outcome. Sometimes a risky decision can produce a completely different result under different circumstances.